Hello wise people, you are listening to the Wise Words Book Club, where we review some of our favourite non-fiction books and we provide you with their key ideas. Not only that, but we teach you how to apply them to the real world and how to benefit from them. If you like what you hear, make sure you click that sexy little follow button and head on over to our website wisewords.blog or our Instagram wisewordsblog, where we upload daily content on all your favourite books. So, without further ado, let's get started.
The origins of virtue. So I think I've got the blurb here from the beginning. Our minds have been built by selfish genes, but they've been built to be social, trustworthy, and cooperative. So this is the paradox that this book is trying to explain. This idea that we, on the one hand, we are built from the ground up by genes that are selfish, but how has this selfishness of the genes led to us being a social, trustworthy, and cooperative species? It talks about this idea that we've all come into the world equipped with predispositions to learn how to cooperate, to discriminate the trustworthy from the treacherous, to commit ourselves to commit ourselves to be trustworthy and to earn good reputations.
I think it's quite interesting because I think a lot of people know of, for instance, Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, and we all kind of know that we're inherently selfish. And a lot of the time, it's it can be taken as kind of an excuse. So, I do this because, I'm genetically programmed to be selfish.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that the other side of the story doesn't get told as much, because the other side of the story was almost prior to this idea of selfish gene and natural selection before Darwin. But I think what this book does nicely is it kind of shows that it's the cooperation of both that makes us who we are.
Yeah.
We're not just either selfish or altruistic. We're both. And in a lot of ways, we're basically selfish in a altruistic way.
Mm-hmm.
It's we are selfish, but we all are selfish. And so we're all striving for the same thing. And so we're all cooperating.
That leads to cooperation, because the sum is bigger than the whole, the parts, if you kind of get
exactly.
I think the big point he talks about is this idea of division of labor. I know he talks about it from the economic sense, but this idea that we can't all do specific things ourselves, and we all specialize in specific skills or problem solving capabilities, right? Even back in the sort of hunter gatherer ages, you probably have the hunters, but you could also have the people who sort of create the weapons, that sort of thing. And this idea that as cooperating, some people create the weapons, some people go out and hunt, that type of thing. We are always better working together than we are individually, and that's this idea that selfishness can actually bring about the cooperation because it's in the best interests of the individual to be cooperative. And that's kind of the whole point here.
Well, I think, a massive point that he illustrates, or he emphasizes in this book, is basically this kind of collectivist and individual attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about with the with the division of labor, he talks about it in terms of bees, and how basically they all have a role, and whether it's according to Darwin's theory of natural selection, we should all be looking for reproductive success, and that's what we're basically programmed for. But that doesn't mean that the individual has to have reproductive success. It could be that the genes itself. And so he talks about it in terms of bees, and how bees have a higher because it's kind of it's complicated, but it's kind of like an incestuous species. And so you have a higher genetic relationship with your brothers and sisters. So it makes more sense to just put your resources into helping your brothers and sisters reproduce,
sure.
And to pass those genes down. And so because of that, it means that you have more you can focus on a specific, this is division of labor, a specific role. And so you have kamikaze bees, and bees that look after the babies, and bees that do this and that and that. And so because you can specialize, you increase the amount of potential, and then if you all work together, then you're all increasing that amount of potential. Whereas if you're all kind of got this egalitarian view where everything has to everyone has to know the same thing to a certain degree, then you're just diluting it all, and you won't be able to progress as far. And that's why he talks in terms of human beings, as in we're amazing at division of labor and specializing, and then when we work together with that specialized field, all cooperated, then we're able to improve so much more.
Sure. No, I love that. I think it is kind of the manifestation of the entire economy. Like everything that's ever happened has been a manifestation of this idea that like we are coming together, trading, building, problem solving, and then solving the problems and selling the solutions to other people is kind of where how the economy's come back to the point where we're at now, right? Think about it from that sort of idea of like dividing, the ability. So somebody creates weapons, etc. Back to the very basic example, but that has helped build the sort of civilization we live in now, which I think's crazy if you think about it. And I think when I was reading it, I was kind of like, all of it kind of makes more sense now. Even like, the Industrial Revolution stuff, and just this idea that like once you've created the solution to the problem, like everybody wants that solution, and we've just consistently built on the previous sort of like knowledge. What I found really interesting is, well, he made a point which was like if you went back 800 million years ago, would we now like, because basically what happened is we've all become dependent on technologies that we use, right? I can imagine there's very few people alive who actually still understand how the stuff was made and why it worked. Like if these people were to disappear and we lost the manuals for all this stuff,
mate,
we'd be absolutely fucked. And I was just thinking like, oh my god, do you know what, we're in quite a fragile situation. So for example, I was thinking like, let's just say there's a massive revolution or something, and I don't know, we took down the internet or something like that, and then we forgot how it was built. We just take ourselves back 30, 40 years. And like, I do think it is that fragile, because unless it's written down, decoded, and like a load of people know something, like this is like the idea of, sorry, back to divisional labor, like people learn how to do things to like create new technologies, etc. And if we go back, like, I mean, I wouldn't even know how to sort of, like when you went to school and did like survival skills.
Yeah, mate, exactly.
Like if I was like out on the bloody wild, how the hell would I survive? Like, we're so used to going to the shops and picking up like a fucking, stir fry or whatever you're gonna cook, like
fine. Well, when like people like, if you were to be on like a desert island, what would you like?
Yeah,
I don't know, what I'd probably die within a fucking week. Like, it was interesting the other day. Like my flat, the water cut out, and I was watching TV the other day, and there was like what is it, UNICEF or like the charity, and it was like showing you like people that didn't have like clean water, and I was just like, fucking hell, it's been like a day here, and we're like, you can't live, and like it's just so nuts how accustomed we come to these things, and we don't even like think about, God, how is cotton made, and how is like all these basic things that we take for granted on a daily basis, and we have no idea how to like.
What I find fascinating as well is I do actually quite like trying to understand how things work, even if it's like a computer or whatever. Because I think when you start understanding, what I love the most is the idea that a lot of this stuff is like really complex, but at the end of the day, it is actually really simple as well. If you look at it from the sort of the parts, if you kind of get me, like all of these complicated things that we created, whether or not it's the idea of the supply chain which gets the food in the fucking supermarket, do actually come from just simple premises. But obviously, simplicity on top of simplicity on top of simplicity. Eventually you end up with this massively complex sort of system.
The thing is like, although it doesn't dive into it much in this book, the only thing with like the idea of constantly building and building and building on top of something is you've got to be pretty fucking sure that the fundamentals were correct in the first place, the origins, the person that first like discovered this thing or this technology, because you end up basically jumping on the bandwagon and pursuing it, but you don't like. You could get to a dead end and be like, "Fuck, why is there a dead end?" And it turns out that one of the original fundamentals, like the things that it was like built on, the foundations, was like incorrect. And so I think it is like having this perspective of like understanding where this technology is now, and like being on the verge of like pioneering it, but also understanding the basics and the foundations, so that you can kind of cross match and be like, okay, well, this does add up, and I can see the relevance, because once you understand the like foundations, then you can understand the rest.
For sure, mate. I'm finding great success at the moment in terms of like literally doing that, just trying to like break it down to the very basics, try not to fucking overcomplicate things before you've even got the very gist. I think that's why, I mean, in hindsight, we've spoken about this quite a lot, but like why we found math so hard, I just never thought we truly understood the whole purpose of it.
It's just understanding the core, abstract concepts.
Just understanding the core of it. But yeah, like I on that topic of sort of like the core, I've got a point here where the slime molds are compressed there. Basically what it was talking about here, I don't know if you got this part from the book, but it talks about this idea that even within the confederations of separate cells in your body, there is like a level of like cooperation going involved as well. I don't know if you got to that bit where it's sort of talking about how like even like at a very cellular level, it's all about like systems of working together. Like
Yeah.
cells could technically be inherently wild to like want to replicate, but they kind of work together in the sense that it's the greater the whole. But then I
But
think
yeah, that's one of like the crazy things that he was talking about was like, these cells, they can, like, you can excel being individualistic,
mm,
and selfish,
mm.
but only up to a point,
Could
and then
cancer be
then
selfish
you
cells?
require the help of others.
Do you get what I mean? Could cancer be selfish cells? Like, it's weird at times because it replicates and makes tumors, and it kills the body, it kills the host. It's almost like cells that have gone too selfish, too rogue, you
Yeah,
know. And then I don't know. I don't know the biology, but like the thought of that kind of makes sense. That something just grows and grows and grows, replicates without being stopped,
yeah,
almost selfishly, right? And then that's where you get cancer, isn't it? Like
yeah.
we get tumors and stuff, which is replicated like massive
But
cells in
I
your body.
guess that's kind of completing its like goal.
Mm,
But if you were to have like one cancer cell that detaches itself from the main cancer cells, then it's not
mm,
going to survive. And that's, I think, the kind of like interesting concept is that, like, there is this temptation to get this short-term benefit and outcompete the others by
mm,
being selfish, but then it's a short-term benefit.
mm.
And if you want to like sustain, then you have to be with others and you have to cooperate with others, because you can't take everything on yourself. And that's very much like the same in our society. It's like, yeah, you can be selfish and manipulative and like try and get your
But then you got
way,
nothing to fall back on, right? And
but
like you're on
exactly.
your own, yeah.
And like, okay, yeah, we live in like a giant world, and I think he talks, I could go to New York and be rude to someone, and I know that my reputation's not at like jeopardy, because I don't know anyone in New York. There's so many strangers. Whereas if I was in like a small, tight knit community,
Hmm.
then there's high risk that people will then judge me because my reputation is on the line.
Sure.
But yeah, like, you can do it up to a certain point, but then you're going to like shoot yourself in the foot,
Hmm.
and then you won't be able to excel.
I think what was really interesting on that sort of note as well about the selfishness and excelling at the expense of others is the fact that cross culturally, like the anthropologists have seen that basically virtue is always exclusively defined as pro-social behavior, and like any vice is always antisocial. And
Yeah,
like what we realize is there's a taboo across like sort of all cultures, right? And that's the taboo against selfishness, which I thought was really interesting. It's really true if you like think about it. Like selfishness is almost the definition of vice, because like murder, theft, rape, and fraud
yeah,
are all crimes, right, of importance. But realistically, all they are is really like selfish acts, because they're committing like the benefit is the person who's doing it, the murder,
yeah,
the theft, rape, and the fraud, right? Like all
yeah,
of the actor is benefiting and the detriment of the victim. So like this idea that actually selfishness itself is just a massive taboo. And like any virtuous act is actually always by almost by definition the greater good of the group. And what I thought was quite interesting is if you start like linking this to like films and heroes and what we myths and what we look up to, and it
yeah,
is true. Like all the heroes in these movies tend to be people who are selflessly acting.
yeah. They're
They're
all
like, you know
virtuous.
what I mean? That
Yeah,
yeah, and the virtue is literally being selfless, selfless, right? And then also I
yeah,
thought about back to the elephant in the brain, right? And this idea that like we're all like inherently selfish, right? And we always pro-social, like all our reasons for doing things are pro-social. How
yeah,
often if somebody goes, oh, why'd you buy yourself a coffee, or like why'd you do this, why'd you do that, and you go, oh, because I wanted to do it because like me, you know?
yeah,
How often when do people ever like say that? If you get what I mean, like, the selfishness is
yeah.
always pushed down because everybody knows it's taboo. So everybody walks around pretending they're like selfless. But if anything, I feel like the people who pretend to be so selfless, the ones who are the most selfish, because
Well, yeah.
you'd be like compensating almost.
Well, that's what they said. Like, we're all fine for like seeing someone do a good deed, but when they're constantly doing it all the time, we're a bit suspicious.
Mm.
Um, but I wonder if like our understanding um, of selfishness is almost tainted by our own language, because it's like, if it outside of evolutionary psychology, selfish is a negative word. Um, and it doesn't necessarily, it just is what it is. If you get what I mean, like,
do you know why it's a negative
it's
word? I just thought
necessary.
about it. I've only just realised this. Of course, it's a negative word because actually there's only one benefactor to selfish behaviour, and that's the individual. So back to what I said to you earlier about the seeds of conflict. So this idea that whenever anybody ever interacts, one person wants something, one other person wants the other thing. There's always the potential for conflict. But that's why selfishness is such a taboo. Because selfishness is literally, like you just said, excelling at the expense of others. So if you're acting selfish, you are almost automatically not benefiting the other person, which actually, if you think about it, is selfish on their behalf, being like, oh, wait, he should be, not being selfish because he should be thinking about me. So if anything, it's just this, it's almost like this is all come from the fact we're all so selfish that we literally have to judge each other by their selfishness. If you kind of get me, like if the logic like, goes around in like a flywheel, like the only reason like we hate selfishness is because they haven't because we're being selfish by them not being selfless to us. Do you get that logic as well? Like
yeah. It's like, why aren't you're buying yourself a coffee? Why aren't you buying me a coffee? Well, then that's selfish of you assuming that I'm going to buy you a coffee.
But then I remember reading quite a lot of this like spiritual stuff quite recently, and it's like it's always back to that, and it's always this point of like, why should you have to act? Like people call it selfish when you act the way you want to act, but isn't it selfish them trying to tell you how to act? Do you get me? It is literally selfish by saying you should be acting this way towards this person, because that's you trying to bend the world to you, which is actually selfish. If you kind of get me, which is the logic. Like it's just circular reasoning. You just go around in circles all day. Which I find quite interesting.
I wonder if you can then like, by doing something that you do for yourself, you do for others, will then end up coming back round, and someone will do it for you.
What do you mean?
It's like you know how he talks about like gift psychology.
Oh yeah, God, yeah, the weaponized. I quite liked it.
It's very cool. Like just the idea of like giving.
Yeah, let's just jump into it. It's a bit later on, but he talks about gifts as weapons. But you can this idea that like because we're so driven to reciprocate, so like when you give somebody a gift, you create an obligation to return it almost.
Yeah, exactly.
So like. Yeah, there was never an obligation to return anything in the first place, but by gift giving, they now have to do it. So you're almost exploiting people's natures. So like his end point was like a true altruist would never give a gift because he would realize that he was either motivated by glory of giving a gift and being virtuous, or doing good, or expecting to get reciprocated. In which, if you were doing that, you wouldn't be an altruist, because that means if you were expecting reciprocation, you'd be doing it because you're unkindly putting them in debt, if you kind of get me.
Yeah. And what I found fascinating was like when he talks about like sharing food, or basically with like gifts, the things that are like gifts are more excessive, so for instance, he gives an example like, 50,000 years ago or whatever, if you went out and you went hunting and you killed a fucking, let's say, an elephant or a mammoth, there's so much meat that you can take your fair share and there's loads left over, but you know that meat is going to go to waste. So to take advantage of that excess meat, you distribute it because you know that the reciprocity from the other people is longer term. So in terms of like reputation, generosity, people like basically attribute these qualities, even though you're not necessarily like doing anything different. You've got your fair share. You've got all the mammoth that
you've got enough and you've got excess. Yeah. Right? I liked his term. He used some bloody financial jargon. He called it it's like buying a derivative instrument with a hedge to risk it. So basically, what he means is like you're hedging your bets. You're like, right, if I've got all this excess meat, I don't need to eat it. So if I give it out to people, the chances are in the future, if I'm ever in trouble, they're going to reciprocate.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is like, it's like
next time I don't catch a mammoth, they do, they'll give me.
Yeah, exactly that. It's like hedging your bets, being like, do you know what, I'm going to be generous here because in the future they're going to be generous to me.
And it's also it's a test. Like if they don't do that, then
not to give it to them, right?
Exactly. They've cut their chances now.
Mm-hmm. Which is almost why I like it. This idea of the weaponizing of it, because we always think of it. For me, actually, what I love about this sort of stuff is it kind of takes away the sort of the bullshit and the fanciness of everybody being like, oh, gift giving, like, all this, like, oh, they're so selfless. But like the majority of the time, it's not actually selfless. Yeah. One, it's socially expected, so everybody has to give gifts. Like it actually literally is now, like Christmas. Like if you didn't give somebody a gift for Christmas, like your family member, they'd be like, what the fuck are you doing? Yeah, and it's not actually because you want to do it. I mean, I feel like when you're forced to do stuff, you want to do it less. Yeah, like, it should be given just for the sake of gift giving. But then his point is like that would actually ultimately be a selfish reason. Yeah. And people might argue saying, "Oh no, it's not at all." But realistically, you want to give a gift because you want to go up in status to the person you give it to,
Yeah, absolutely.
or you want to get a gift back. So, and whether or not you realize that's your motivation, then up to you. But
I did like his point about like families in general, how basically there's kind of this acceptance that if I was to get you a gift now, I'm not expecting something straight away back.
Mhm.
I'm not expecting you to suddenly buy me a gift as well. But I do know that over time you will give me a gift, not expecting me to suddenly give you a gift back.
Mhm.
And so it's more like the closer you get, the more long term you can still do these things, but like you have a longer like time span
Sure.
of doing it.
Well, the
And
idea.
I think that's quite cool. So like that's why we're all very like lenient with our like family and everything like that, because we know that in the grand scheme of things, later on they will reciprocate.
No, for sure. Like you can almost trust them better. I think another
Yeah.
one was interesting. Actually, there's a part of it as well, but not even just reciprocating. Where it's actually like they don't even feel the need to reciprocate. Some of them, like with family members, like there is less need. Like, fine, I get the point of like not even like when somebody buys you a gift who's not a family member, you can then be like, shit, I got to get them something soon, or like,
Yeah.
you know,
It's like he bought me something for my birthday, I've got to buy him for something for his.
Yeah. You almost set up the exchange of trade because nobody wants to be that guy who just doesn't reciprocate.
Actually, how funny is that when we were at school, if you were invited to a birthday party,
you'd always invite them back.
Need to invite them back.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I get that 100%. It's almost like you could become popular by basically just throwing a load of parties and inviting.
But that was it. The people that held a party that invited the whole year or whatever, they were normally like they're almost buying their popularity because they know that every time everyone else has a.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
popularity. You're right, but you do it by you basically do it by opening up the trade exchange.
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
I mean, you could almost argue it's the same with people you haven't spoken to in a while.
I could just imagine a little 12-year-old being like, "Oh no, I'm only holding this party so I can open up the trade exchange."
Yeah, be popular. Well, if you're 12, I imagine. Yeah, if I go back to 12-year-old self, be like, right, okay, Jeff, you just set up loads of parties and you'll instantly be popular. There you go. That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
I definitely think there's some truth to that as well because people will feel the need to reciprocate. But then also you become the ultimate loser if nobody reciprocates. Can you imagine? That is social ostracization taken to like the creme de la creme. Like
It is, but then I think the fact that those people will not they'll be judged for it, so they would invite you, or in most cases they would, because they would feel that if they didn't, then their reputation would be judged.
Sure. I based on this reciprocity thing, I've got some few notes on it as well, so I'm going to just quickly go into it. So I like this idea that they talk about how there's a specific part of the brain involved in recognizing people, and and they were saying that that's basically not only does it help with obviously reputation and basically being able to hold people accountable for like bad actions, but also the ability to recognize others and keep score of like exchanges.
The recognition aspect.
Yeah, and he talked about it. Like, I love it. Like, he's talked about this how reciprocity hangs like a sword of Damocles. I don't know if you heard of. I don't know this obviously some sort of Greek myth over every human head. And then he gave a few examples, and I quite liked it. It's like, he's only asking me to go to his party, so I'll give him a good review. They've been to dinner twice and never asked us back once. After all, how could you do that to me? But it's quite funny how like if you actually look at all these complaints, do you know what? Like, and even when you complain, and even when you hear other people complain, how often is it like that it's this idea that they feel like they've been shortchanged? And this is back to the seeds. This is back to the seeds of conflict, right? So if you feel like you've done somebody a favor, you are honestly looking for a favor back. And I feel like this is why so many people fall out, because they feel like this is almost why, like with you guys, like you, Will, and George, I don't feel like we're doing like reciprocity too much at all.
Yeah.
If you kind of get me. And because I'm not keeping score, it's like it makes our life so much easier. Because if I was there, sat here going, right, Tristan, I've lent him this once, I've lent him this once. You know, like he's fucking taking advantage of me, right? And if you treat everybody like that, you're just gonna end up in trouble. And I feel like this is why there's a lot of complaints. And like if you really do listen to the core of most people's complaints, it's always to do with this idea that they feel that something hasn't been reciprocated, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. But like Will and I were talking about it last week, funnily enough, this exact point, because he's obviously reading Elephant in the Brain.
Oh yeah.
And I was saying that like I think the more you get to know someone, the less you see them as like you label them. So like
yes.
Will's the funny guy and George is the sweet guy. I don't label you guys like that anymore. And because you have all these different qualities and you're just you, then I now can't compete, if you get what I mean. So basically, there's no element of competition, and so I don't feel judged or
yes, that makes a lot of sense.
like I have to, like reciprocation just occurs, and that's kind of what we were talking about with family. Is in like, you don't see.
Oh, you know them so well. Yes, I get it. It's not like you don't categorize them as like this type of person. They're just them. Yes.
And which means you can't compete, because and also I think if you also see yourself as a certain kind of person, you have certain traits like, oh, I think of myself as funny, but Will's the funny guy, and now he said a funny joke, so I've got to like say a funny, like, do you know what I mean? There's like, you're introducing this element of competition, but as soon as you break away from labeling, it's like,
I have to say that's very true, by the way. Yeah, I do think like you're right, because jealousy and envy actually come from the idea that like of competition to a degree. If you're both competing for the same thing and it's a zero sum game, like you're both competing to be, like you just said, like for example, could be the funniest one, whatever.
Yeah.
If you're both competing for that role, then there's only one winner. Therefore, there's going to be envy. There's going to be jealousy. Whereas if you just see like them as the whole, I do get it. It makes so much sense to me, and basically it kind of fits into what I was trying to say to you. I think it was yesterday, with this idea of like categories and prototypical thinking. So like you see somebody and you judge them immediately through like this lens of like, let's just say the clothes they're wearing and the way they're carrying themselves. You're like, that's the prototype. He looks like, I don't know, this type of person I've got in my head, and this is them. But as you get to know them better, you realize they're a human being with flaws, their goals. They're more multifaceted than just that label. And what I found quite interesting is this idea that like when you get to know people really well, you're right, it melds from that category of like, they're like this to like, them as a whole person.
Yeah, exactly.
And therefore you compete with them less and rest easy.
Well, because you can't compete. You're not Will 2.0. You're not exactly the same person. So and like, because you're not like competing for a specific trait, then there's nothing to compete for anymore.
So I'd only say there's only ever some, I wouldn't even say anger, but the only ever time it gets ever competitive is when you play sports against each other or whatever. Like that's the other time I ever feel like, for example, if we played chess, there probably would be a level of like, fucking go, let's go at it. Like, because obviously you play quite a lot, but like
you're not always in that like environment where that trait is being emphasized. So like, how often do you play sports with your mates? Or like it would be the same like if you, I don't know, if you went to dinner, like you're a different person when you go to dinner, and so like obviously so many different environments like emphasize different traits, but most of the time, the more you get to know someone, the more you're just like, well, it doesn't, I don't see him as that specific trait.
I know, which is what I thought was quite interesting is like people who end up being celebrities, right, are famous, and basically their friends know them who they are. They probably just joke about it all the time. Every time they see them, like, fucking hell, you're that guy. You're like, because they know you for you, not as the one you're labeled as. So what I mean is like you could become super famous for like, I'm sure people like, I've been thinking a lot about people like, people like Jeff Bezos, maybe like billionaire, right? And obviously labeled as like the really smart business guy. But I bet you all his old friends who know him will probably meet with him. He probably is like a really smart guy, don't get me wrong. But they see him as Jeff. Like what I'm saying is we like these labels help deify people who you don't know. And they begin to like start to like summarize who that person is in your head, like the super smart guy. But to some other people, that's just Jeff, or like that's just this person.
All these roles include these kinds of traits. Like look about like teachers and all these people that have like these different kinds of position, hold these different positions, they have connotations to them. But then once you get to like, it's funny, like when we left school and then we went to have like a pint with one of our teachers, it just like it's kind of just that whole facade is just crushed away, and you're like, fucking hell, you're just a normal person at the end.
So this idea that like, there's that saying, isn't it, don't meet your heroes. And the more I think about it, the more like I see Instagram and I see this like this image, like we're in this image orientated society, right? And like what is behind that image? What, like, obviously that's what they're trying to show me, but what is the real person? You know what I mean?
Like, it's like you're chiseling away at some marble, and then every time you find something new, it's you're chiseling.
I feel like this is almost kind of why there's this like counterculture movement towards being honest and like showing your scars and showing your, like, even celebrities doing it now, like, oh, this is the truth. This is me without makeup or whatever. This is me, like, this is behind the facade. Exactly. I think it's just quite interesting how our mind actually just like back to the prototype, just like sort of sets on something until you get to know it. It's interesting. We should give people more the benefit of the doubt, right? People just judge people first, which I know is like a way of saving mental energy, but
it is interesting because obviously, we do have stereotypes, and they're basically used so that we can navigate the world when we can't take in as much information.
Yeah, you're
so
right.
It's like
It's judgment.
there's
It's heuristic,
an
isn't it?
well, yeah, like there's an essence of truth to these stereotypes, but not to
It's more like
on like a
statistical
general
truth,
level.
right? It's more like a
Yeah,
what is it? It's like this idea that like statistically, yes, there might be a correlation between the traits, but actually there's so much variation between that category. I think that's his point.
but that is it because the essence of truth, it applies to the generalization to the general population, but it may not apply on the individual level, and yet we attribute it on the
Yes.
individual level.
Mate, literally, that's exactly this guy's point here. So he's like, as social psychologist Robert Brown pointed out, the main difference between categories of people and categories of other things is that when you use a prototypical example to stand for a category of things, no one takes offense. So what he means by this is, so for example, when a dictionary used sparrow to stand for all birds, emus, ostriches, and penguins and eagles did not go on the attack because obviously they didn't care. Do you get what I mean? Like, but just imagine what would have happened if the dictionary had a picture of a soccer mum to illustrate a woman, and a picture of a business to illustrate a man. And he goes, of course, people will be right to take offence since a prototype can never represent the variation that exists in these categories. It's just that birds don't care, but people do. But I quite like this idea that like you just said, like they kind of stand for something, but when you get to meet people, you start seeing all the ways they differ from that prototype, or they differ from the stereotype. I think stereotype's definitely a better way of saying actually prototypes can confuse people. But like stereotypes exist, but only in our minds really, and they sort of stand as the sort of center point to judge somebody. So let's say you meet somebody who like looks like a stereotype of this, and then you have the stereotype, and then you can start judging through that stereotype and seeing like, oh, that doesn't fit, and then you get to know them more, and you're like, oh wait, actually, hang on a second, they have this like level here, but they're also like this, and and once again, like you said, different situations, like testing somebody's characters, putting them in like tough situations. There's like when things are easy, people seem to be chill, don't they? Like it's one of those things that test people. You really need to put them in hard situations. But yeah, that was kind of like a detour, but I can't remember how we even got onto that.
It's all kind of linked. You got the gift psychology.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah. I think another thing about that gift cycle thing is he talked about asymmetries in social cognition. So he's talking about like people are better looking for cheating than altruism. I think his point was like,
say that again.
Our social cognition is way better at finding cheaters than looking for altruism.
Yeah.
So like we have like shortcuts to identify cheaters compared to altruists.
Yeah.
And I quite like this idea because it kind of basically for me it showcases almost why we're so voyeuristic, or most people like love gossip magazines, because this idea that we are so honed in on finding cheaters that we see. This is not me personally, but like there's loads of people out there who love gossip, love like hearing about celebrities who fuck up and stuff, because they love to see that this person who's deified, is a cheater, or like he isn't the fucking perfect person that everybody thinks he is, or they are. So they like to sort of see it because it's their way of like snuffing out a cheat. If you kind of get me, It's quite an interesting idea, and I do see that we definitely look at people more for like, is he cheating the situation than is he being a good person, or like even if somebody does a good act, you're almost always looking like, why are they doing that,
Yeah, no, exactly. Trying to make sense of it, and like I think it's because I guess we don't want to be cheated, and that's why we have this sensitivity to people cheating, because we don't want people to take advantage of us.
Mm-hmm.
And what's funny is that through our process of looking for cheaters, we find the ability to cheat. And this is kind of like what I think like Elephant in the Brain was kind of talking about, is that like you're constantly competing, trying to find this way of like upping the other person without seeming like you're upping the other person. And so like, if we can cheat and get away with it, then fine. But if that is at the expense of others and they find out, and this is where the whole like collectivist attitude comes in. It's like we can cheat and we can benefit short term, but later on, if that hurts the collective, then like we're fucked, because then the collective will like
will punish. Well, this essentially the collective, meant to punish. Well, this is back to where the emotions evolved. Like the emotions are meant to be there to sort of the idea of like moral disgust and stuff is there to punish people who cheat.
Yeah.
I also felt quite interesting, but it's in the blank slate. It was mainly like this idea. Now there's an argument for like, I guess this whole idea of reciprocity as well had this idea that things should be fair, which is actually where a lot of this tension now comes. I know we've had a discussion about it before, like with the billionaires and stuff. And it's quite interesting because this has brought it forward, like politically, like this idea that how can somebody have so much and other people have so little, and this idea of fairness is like, it's almost like the evidence towards their criminality, like the rich people, like billionaires, is the fact they are successful and rich. Do you kind of get me?
Yeah.
I found it quite interesting, but it also definitely has to do with the fact that we are a moral species where fairness is kind of one of our main values across cultures.
Yeah.
If you kind of get me, like if you're undeserved of that success, or if you're thought to be undeserved of the success, or if you have too much success, you then get deified in a bad way. Can you get me? You get vilified.
Well, I think like that's why like we talk about every other book but this book, but
literally.
with like Elephant of the Brain, when basically like social norms are created to stop intentions of people, you know, excelling and out competing against the collective. It's kind of interesting because it's like, in order to keep everything fair, but then fair, like the baseline of fair has to excel at some point, because like I was talking to my mate the other day about, are we, you know, is society supposed to act from the worst well-off person? Is that fair? Okay. If you know, if we have this thing against people excelling over the collective, then surely the collective should be the average rather than like someone who's like has a disability or is impaired, or you know, in like but like, life in general. Yeah. So then, and like what I find is that like, you know, governments and things like that, where political correctness comes in, is that you have to work from the like least well-off person. But then, is that fair? You know, it's
what is fair, I guess.
Like
it's one of these deep sort of, like, you could argue about this for hours. You can even argue like the role, like, you know, for example, there's like a PC movement towards like not hurting people's feelings, but then again, the role of hurting somebody's feelings, for example, like ostracizing somebody or like, you know, shaming them, is actually not to make them like, you know, want to, you know, commit suicide or something, but the actual role of shame is to motivate them to, you know, change. If you kind of get me, it's not like, you can argue both sides. Like, I'm not saying you should go around shaming people, but like one of the roles of shame is to create change. So it's one of those double-edged swords. So like, if you stop people from being able to shame people, you know, that's almost like the weapon of people who try to shame people for shaming other people. You know, it's just it's like a it's just nuts. It fucks me every time I try and think about it. But let's just move back onto this book. Like, you know, we just keep getting off. A few things. What I've got, we got the asymmetries. I thought quite an interesting one is later on in the book. He talks about being trade being the glue of alliances, and I like this like metaphor that like the idea is that trade comes first and then alliance is second. Like this idea of like, you know, swapping resources. And then that glues you together, especially as long as the transaction is good. If you get me, because then you can always trust them to a degree.
I tell you what, just adding quickly back on the whole gift thing, what I found, because it's kind of related to the trade, I guess, you know, proposing resources, whatever, is the fact that like it doesn't have to be the same exact gift. I think that's kind of interesting in terms of like, for instance, one of my lectures on evolutionary psychology was talking about like vervet monkeys, green monkeys, and how if one is like grooming one, then that monkey is more likely to help in a fight. Okay. And it's not the same gift. You're not reciprocating the same.
But this is almost like division of labor, isn't it? Again, like
And so what's interesting is that how do animals, or how do we basically weigh up what is a good enough gift to give back? As in, like, is it worth risking my life to fight to help someone who's just taken a few fucking nits out of my hair? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
As in, like, it's like a different. You're reciprocating with something differently, and we all seem to have this kind of like inbuilt calculation method to be like, what is that worth? This is it.
But this is what I find so interesting. Is because like, I guess the idea of money, okay, or the idea of like a currency brings about mathematical precision to a transaction. So beforehand, you could be like, right, I'm going to do this for you, and you're going to do this for me. And obviously, you could be like, oh, is this? But like, it's based on feeling. You get what I mean? Like, there's no scientific analysis to be like, right, he fought for me, and I picked his fucking nits.
Exactly. It's emotion.
It's more like, how are you satisfied with that transaction?
I guess so.
But then what I find interesting with the money thing is like, you bring like an absolute value to something, so then people can like sort of rationalize and use that to be like, oh, was it definitely worth this? But you paid £10 for my gift and you paid 15. Oh, fuck me, like you cheapskated me by £5. But then it's like, what about the effort and thought that went into it? And that's what I'm really interested about that sort of stuff. There's no like people often prefer something which is like well thought through and handcrafted than something that was just a £10 from Amazon, because they know that there's thought and effort, and this is like the costly signaling stuff. But it's worth well, yeah, I didn't even think about that. Especially with this idea of like without money, there's no like objective value, and even when there is money, there's still no objective value, because who the fuck says that like that notebook there with an extra couple of bits of stitching is £10 and that one's £5, because the values in the holder, like.
Yeah, it is like, I think it is emotional based, because I remember one of these videos I watched on YouTube, and it was showing you some kids, and basically one got to choose how many chocolate coins it gave to the other person, and they had like 10 chocolate coins, and obviously we think fairness is like what 50-50, so like 5 coins each.
I assume it was that same experiment that I'm thinking of, where it was like they were given 10 buttons or something.
Yeah.
And they were told to split it as they wanted, and the other person had to accept it. But the other person knew they had 10, right? And first of all, the majority of people actually did just give 50-50, or like something like That just shows we have like a natural penchant for like projecting to the future and being like, right, what's fair? Because we know then that they're going to see us. Whereas I think also another interesting point was when it was anonymous, a lot of people actually tried to take more.
Yeah, no, exactly.
There was no like reputation involved and stuff, but
because the reputation is not online, so that why like. Yeah, online you have more of a almost like selfish attitude, and that's why I guess you get like trolls and things like that. But like it was interesting in this study because they had like kids doing it. So initially the kids would keep like 8 chocolate buttons or whatever, and then give 2 to the other person. But it technically for the other person who's getting those 2 buttons, logically that would make sense. You're 2 buttons up, from 0. But they would refuse it because they don't want the other person almost taking advantage of it, and and it's an unfair deal. Whereas like up to the point of where they feel satisfied. So like then they redid the experiment, and then they were like, okay, now you get to do it again, and everyone would basically like split it 5-5. Some would do it 4, and the other person would still accept. So it all is depending on like
how fair. Yeah, what's your cut-off point, right? What's your cut-off point for fairness?
Exactly.
I think it's kind of related in the sense that like quite a lot of the motivation of that experiment can be summarized by the idea that you are going to be held responsible. So like I said, if you're anonymous, a lot of people tend to just try and give even less, because they were like, well, there's no punishment for me if I can cheat, and then even if I get caught cheating, you don't know who I am. Back to like the anonymity of like the internet and trolls, right?
Yeah.
So he talks about way later in the book. I don't know if he got to this point. So he talks about the tragedy of the commons. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's like a hypothetical example.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Where like there's a commons where you're allowed to graze. I think it was like sheep or something. And he talked about the incentives for somebody so nobody owns the land, right? And everybody's got all their different sheep on it. So who's going to overgraze? And basically this idea that the tragedy of the commons is that it's in everybody's incentives to defect, and just because there's no responsibility for who owns the field. They all just overgraze, and everybody else then can't graze.
Yeah.
And then he basically, I never thought about it this way. So obviously one of the main like points of capitalism is this idea of ownership, and like ownership, like because I read this economics book as well, explained, which is really good as well on this. Is like the idea of owning something. So for example, before like the medieval times, right, the only people who could own anything was like the lords.
Yeah.
And then everybody else is just like work on the land, right? And basically what capitalism did is give private ownership to loads of other people, right? And kind of the point here is when you have ownership of something, you're more likely to take care of something because it's in your best interest. So when somebody owns the commons or part of the commons, it's in their best interest to take care of it.
So if you're invested, that's kind of links into the like, skin in the game.
Yeah. So like when incentives aren't there, so progress stagnates. Okay. And another, literally, this is what I was trying to make the point. So it does link into skin in the game. Because what I mean by links in skin in the game, so like if that brings about responsibility, so like having ownership of something, the idea of being responsible for your perception and reputation also inherently puts the incentives towards being pro-social. So what I mean is when you have to take responsibility for the way people see you, it means you have to act in a way which is more selfless, because if you keep being selfish, you're going to get punished.
Yeah.
And this idea of responsibility is quite interesting, because one of the last paragraphs in the whole book, he takes like a quote and says like, let reputation rule. So like let everybody rise and fall by their reputation.
Yeah.
And what I find quite interesting is I think we spoke about this before with the skin in the game. It's like what's happening now is like, politicians and stuff are being so defensive with their decision making and stuff. Is like nobody can hold them responsible. It's back to like we spoke about the statistics stuff as well. Like you can sort of fake statistics in a way that like you can sort of use different numbers like the mode, the mean, and the median to sort of slay, like to take the same number set, and portray it in a way that's positive for you, and that way you avoid responsibility, or this idea that when you have responsibility for something, the incentives flip so that it's in your best interest to like work on it long term.
Because I know he uses an example of like electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Like no one no one owns it. We all use it. We all borrow it. But then if someone else is paying for it, for example, then like we can take advantage of it. So I guess that's why we all pay for bills and stuff like that. And then
I think the ownership things. By the way, ownership things make things fair.
Yeah.
You kind of get me. So if we are really concerned about fairness, ownership kind of makes things fair to a degree. Don't get me wrong. I think the system's rigged in certain ways, right? Like the financial system and everything. Ownership so you have the responsibility, you have the incentives to build something. So I think what the main point of like the transition to everybody having ownership of like capital and like, having their own land led to people to be able to, it led to better social change and the ability to change a situation because you have ownership of something and you then take responsibility. And when you have like if we all just shared the same, this is why like communism has failed multiple times, because if you all shared the same thing, there's nobody who's held responsible for like overgrazing and like yeah. So like the feedback mechanism works. Like if somebody's upset, they can complain, and then you just like the example would be like I think Rory Sutherland always uses this. Like in communist Russia, it was like to do with bread, right? When you have a brand, okay, that create bread, you try the bread and it's really nice, and it starts becoming really shit. Then you're like, fine, I don't like this brand anymore. I'm gonna move to the next brand, and then they're punished because of the bad bread. But when you have everybody who just produces random bread, like because there's a communist, there's no brand, there's nobody responsible to complain when the bread's shit. That's the whole point. You need the feedback mechanism of ownership and responsibility, because the whole idea of accountability means people can hold you accountable for something to then improve. That's what reputation is, isn't it? Think about it. Like it's accountability.
Yeah, because otherwise there's a system in which it can be taken advantage of, and the only reason it's held together is because of this collectivist attitude. So if one starts to drop away and another one starts to drop away, all because for a short term they can benefit and they don't have to, I don't know, pay for electricity. But then if everyone does that, then no one has electricity. And it's like it's this, by owning something or having a stake in something, you're more likely to be invested in it, and therefore your reputation is invested in it, and all these kind of different aspects. But you're more likely to sustain it.
Yeah. No, I just thought it was a really interesting and really deeply insightful point, because like I it's one of these things you take for granted. This whole idea of like capitalism and owning property and owning. When I say property, I don't even mean like actual property. I just mean like you can own stuff. Like you have legal rights to own even ideas. That didn't exist in the past. And this whole idea of ownership basically puts incentives to create new things. And like this is why I get why some people now, like I used to be like, there is like arguments against capitalism. Well, I think it's like, it's not without its failings, but like this idea that it, like, anybody can own, like anybody can create anything. And the incentives are so aligned that people need to create such great things to sort of enhance our species. And it's led to that, because of the fact we're all kind of self-motivated. But it was one of these things that I didn't really get it before, and now after reading this book, I kind of get this whole idea of like the ownership, and whether the ownership is like even the reputation side of things, like taking ownership for who you are and like how you present yourself.
That's where I think like things fail, when you have a system that gives you everything, and you don't like a nanny state. It's like you're not owning anything, you're not really part of anything, and so. Like, there's so many problems with like the welfare state or like the NHS system, and like it's like actual ability to like, you don't feel like you're part of it, so you can just take advantage of the system.
Yeah. One of his points, like, order emerges perfectly from chaos, not because of the way people are bossed about, but because of the way they react to incentives. And like, if you set the incentives so people are going to get paid to be on the welfare state and they find a loophole, they're going to use it. Like,
because why would you not? Like, if we're selfishly driven, and it's not. You have that like kind of almost plausible deniability with getting away with it by acting selfish. then why wouldn't you? People are going to cheat. People are going to take advantage of systems if there's holes.
Exactly, if there's holes in them, mate, you could see the same with like tax loopholes and everything, right?
Yeah,
If there are holes in
absolutely.
systems, people go for it. And
But realistically, there's holes in every kind of system and every kind of rule. But it depends whether someone is actively looking for that hole or not.
of course,
You know.
but they will though. If it's in their best interest to find it.
And like you said, we will look for people who cheat.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if we find someone who cheats, but it's also beneficial,
this is what I find quite
us,
interesting about like just like semantics and language about how you can like reframe cheating. Like a lot of people do it. It's like just using different words or changing scenarios, and like I guess it's the art of rhetoric is presenting truths in different ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, mate, that was one of the leaving points I got. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we didn't really touch on.
Well, the thing is, like, everything kind of ties into it. The book talks about, the kind of almost the evolution, the like timeline of our idea, like how we understand altruism as it is now.
Yeah,
and,
or like how we understand our cooperation based on the fact that we are selfish, right? And like the idea of like what you're just saying, reciprocation. We've said reputation,
but in every interaction, it's present. So everything we've just been talking about is relevant because it's.
I would say like one of the things I try and do now is like because I've been reading a lot around this sort of area. It's just like when you're in a situation with other people, just sort of catch yourself. Catch yourself when you're being. What's the worst word? When you're like trying to search for stuff and just ask yourself, what are your motives? Like, what are you looking at that certain thing? Like, are you monitoring how much they're giving you? Are you monitoring this? Are you monitoring that? Like, you'd be intrigued by how much insight this sort of stuff can give you into yourself.
Yeah,
because we all like it.
Absolutely, and we're all the same. Like, we're all literally have these like almost this push pull between being selfish and being altruistic, but like. You just the more you're aware of your actions, the more you're likely to know whether you're doing it for selfish reasons or not.
Which it was Thomas is one of my favorite books. Yeah, he's a great writer.
Yeah, Matt Ridley, by the way, in case we didn't say his name.
I don't know if he did, to be honest. Get there at the end. I'm just going through it all now. Yeah, pretty much got there. Thomas, my main takeaways are like it's just deeper look into like human interaction. I do love this idea that like obligations, sort of bargain, debt, and favors are always like, and the reciprocity are like the core of human sort of interactions.
Yeah.
Like even an interesting one as well is even this idea of reciprocity of like speaking. So like you bump into somebody, you speak to them. Like they obviously it's really rude to not reciprocate like a hi. Do you kind of get me?
Yeah.
Like acknowledging somebody exists. It's hard to be like, oh, you just completely.
Isn't it funny that hi from the other person is almost a gift in itself and makes you want to reciprocate? Like,
of course it is, because he's knowing they're like acknowledging your existence to a degree.
Yeah.
Then what else do we have? Yeah, we had the idea of trade, we had the idea of like responsibility, tragedy of the commons.
I think my main point to take away from this is this collectivist and individual attitude. And yes, we are inherently selfishly programmed, but it only brings us short-term benefit realistically, because we can't survive by ourselves for so long, and so we have to at some point be altruistic and cooperate. Hence why we're social animals.
Yes,
and it's better if we do that from the get-go, because if we're selfish for such a long time, then our reputation is damaged.
I think the interesting like crux of it is the idea that selfishness itself brings about cooperation. Because it's in the selfish motive itself brings about altruism, because the fact that it's selfish to actually want to get cooperation by giving gifts or building up your reputation, acting pro-socially. I think he even makes the point in this book at some point, I can't remember where it was, this idea like, why is it that some people just, when they don't have to act altruistically, they still do it anyway? Like if they're in a restaurant miles away from where they live, they still give a tip.
Exactly. Where they'll never be able to like.
Well, they'll never. So, like for example, one of his main points is like half of the reputation game is the fact that because you have to repeatedly interact with people, you act less selfishly because people are going to develop a reputation for you. So he's like, why do people then, on holiday still donate money? And it's this idea that they're still like they're generous or they're altruistic, and it's just quite an interesting view of it. There's also a level of social conformity, I think, to be honest. This idea of like when you're abroad and you're used to it being a social norm to pay, you just do it because it's like a norm. I would feel guilty not, and also because you're confused, you don't know what the norm is, so you might as well. But yeah,
Well, yeah, but it's like norms are basically generic rules, and we don't take into consideration that like a lot of the time when I go to New York, I'm not suddenly going to act like an asshole, you know. So like I will still maintain like stay in line with a lot of these norms. So
Of course, but you got to pick up the norms first, right? Like to a degree as
yeah,
well.
exactly. If we had like a rule for every single context that we come into contact with, it wouldn't work because there'd just be so many things looming over us. But you know, we do have those kinds of things. Like we walk in, if we're going to like a dinner party and we take our shoes off, you know, or we like assume that we should take our shoes off because otherwise it's rude, or things like that, or like take a hat off when you're inside. Like all these kinds of different norms that I guess are more relevant to certain contexts than others. Yeah, but I think like also with like this whole, you know, yes, there are like people that yes, we all do like we all behave in ways that may have a selfish intention, but why judge the intention when the result is altruistic? You know, it's like it doesn't matter whether you know you give money to charity because you want to like increase your social status. The fact is you've helped people by giving money.
Yeah. So why judge on the? I get it, mate.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Why
really
judge on
interesting
the
as well.
intention?
He does make the point later on, by the way, and it's kind of what you touched on at the very beginning. We shouldn't use it as too much of a reason because otherwise people use it to rationalize everything. So he's like, if man is basically motivated by self-interest, doesn't it like encourage people to be more selfish? And apparently there was like he was talking about like a study with economist students who were told about this sort of self-interest model, and they actually all became more selfish and they all rationalized it more, being like, oh, well, everybody else is.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
But like the whole point was, like as we were trying to say earlier, like these emotions and like morality has actually evolved to make you more motivated to be selfless, even if it is like deep down a selfish motive. But like you just said, what's so bad if they are still acting the way they're selfless?
Yeah.
Exactly. What is wrong with it if they are actually, you know, donating money to charity, etc.? Like what is like just because you think they don't have the best interests, but actually if somebody's motivated by emotions, they tend to be like they've almost co-opted themselves into believing the selflessness. Like you feel guilty to pay money, like, you know, or you feel angry to punish somebody's defecting. These are like that doesn't make him selfish. It actually means he's going against his best interest. But
and I think like something to finish off for me is I remember reading that Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene. He said that he wrote the book not to give people, you know, the incentive to act selfish, and to like disregard altruism, but the complete opposite. By shining a light on our selfish behaviour, it should shine a light on our altruistic behaviour, and that we do need to cooperate. And it's exactly what I was saying at the very beginning in terms of this whole spectrum thing. It's like, you know, selfishness doesn't exist without altruistic behaviour, you know? And so like they both go hand in hand, and the long-term benefit is to be altruistic through a selfish means.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
There you go. All right.
Well, hopefully that piqued your curiosity, guys. After all, that's why we're here. If you'd like to know more about this book, head on over to our website, wisewords.blog. And if you have a particular book in mind you think we should review, send us a DM to our Instagram at wisewordsblog. Until next time, guys, have a good one.